Hi, this month we are going to explore the difference between fractional, interim, and permanent hires. And to cover that conversation, I've invited Tim Emmitt and Greg Simsa from Bridge Leadership Solutions, who focus on the fractional and interim solutions for family-owned companies. And I'll cover the permanent hire and executive search roles. Across this month, we'll do 3 videos diving into the interim fractional side, the permanent hire, and then also in the final video, we'll discuss how those things can be woven together and serve client need going forward. So if you are a advisor to a family, an attorney, a banker, a family business consultant, or perhaps you are a family business owner yourselves and you have executive transition on the hire, there are a lot of solutions out there, and this video is to help disambiguate and help you understand how those different solutions can serve your needs. The first video of the month, we're going to cover interim and fractional solutions and how they can serve the needs of private enterprises. To discuss this, I've got Tim Emmitt and Greg Simsa from Bridge Leadership Solutions. Tim and Greg, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. I'm Tim, and this is Greg next to me. We have a consulting practice where we do a lot of performance improvement with small and medium-sized, mostly family business, some other closely held businesses. We find that the normal situations where companies really benefit from like an interim role or a fractional role are those situations where they need somebody in the position, but they want to take the time really to find the permanent person. And that lends itself very well to an interim situation.
First, once there's a need identified, it's really trying to step back and making sure you've got a clear definition of exactly what are the needs of the company. So what's the type of person? What's the type of resources? Our perspective is that there's not a one size fits all, solution. Mm-hmm. And so taking time to step back and really saying, all right, what are my options here? I think is step one. Obviously a permanent is the right option for a lot of companies. But again, we just encourage people to step back and ask the question in terms of, is there an alternate here? Do you have a deep team? Do you have people that can step up and, fill a gap, while you're searching for that next person? Maybe it's a situation where you don't have a succession plan. This wasn't a known event. Life happened, and all of a sudden you find that you need to replace somebody, shortly. I think from my perspective, stepping back and really doing that, I think a fractional or an interim often can bring a perspective, a fresh outside perspective to say, hey, you guys are going down this path and you've got a clear definition in your minds of what you need or you're looking for. In a family business, a lot of times, sometimes they have blinders in terms of they've been doing certain things a certain way for a long time. And in fairness, a lot of times it's worked well for them. But I think what we find is for companies that really want to, are intentional about taking something to the next level, they should take that pause and really ask the questions of, what do I need today? And then what do I really need for where the organization is going? And that's where interim and fractional resources and often the experience and perspectives that they bring can help in that process.
One thing I would cue in here, if I may, is one of the central issues we find in leadership transition in family companies is that the incumbent CEO has oftentimes been there for multiple decades, and they'll have issues letting go of control. And that central issue, letting go of control, can be a big risk for a permanent hire. Could you guys perhaps reflect on how the fractional or interim solution can help mitigate some of those challenges?
So, yeah, that's a common problem that we see is, especially founders of businesses, it's their baby, right? They started it, they grew it, and they're continuing to grow it. And letting go of that control can be extremely difficult. If the next generation isn't quite ready, then this is a great opportunity to bring in an interim solution or even a fractional solution or even a consultant, frankly, to help coach that next generation and to help bridge that gap between, father and son or mother and daughter or whatever that, situation is, and help resolve any conflicts in their different goals. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we see is the next generation, a lot of times, they want to do things very different from how the past generation, and they think they've got a better mousetrap. Having a third party come in can really help distill that down to, do you really have a better mousetrap? and ask those difficult questions, both down and up in that relationship.
Tim, if I could just add to that,
Sure.
I think, again, this interim fractional, and of course, you want to make sure you hire the right interim and fractional. That's just as important as hiring the right permanent. But I also think in that process, a lot of times the interim or the fractional comes into these family businesses. They've seen a lot of things, right? So they've seen, again, here's what you do today, but they also often have a vision for where do you really need to be. So let's say the finance function, I'm thinking about a CFO,
Mhm.
a fractional CFO, and let's just say they haven't really kept up on collection methods, or they're not doing cash flows or forecasting and some of those things. It really provides an opportunity to really talk to the CEO right before they're going and making a permanent placement decision to really say what are the skill sets that you really need, and is there alignment right in terms of, do we want to take this function to that next level, or are they looking for more of a caretaker? They like things the way they are, status quo. We're happy. We don't want to change. That may be appropriate for the business as well. But I think really flushing that out really helps when you get to the permanent, placement decision and finding that right, long-term resource.
One point that I would add when I am advising clients to look at fractional or interim executives is when we sense that there's a high risk of conflict in the transition from a principal managing the business to a hired gun, so to speak. And the central reason is a permanent hire has severance clauses in their contracts that will mean if the new hired executive comes in and comes into conflict with a family principal that's having difficulty letting go or resistant to change, that severance contract can have a big financial impact on the business, let alone the cultural impacts of conflict in the executive suite. A interim or fractional executive, by design of the contractual relationship, is ultimately easier to change than a permanent hire would be.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Bill. And, I think along those lines, you're reminding me, a lot of times, particularly in what we have today when we're recording this video, which is a really competitive labor market, you have to be realistic about, if you're looking for that permanent solution, it may take several months to find that person, to really vet them, to do your background, make sure they're the right fit. And in the time, do a realistic assessment about, can you survive, or do you really need some type of support, again, in that, whatever that transitional period might be. Again, right now in this labor market, finding the right person for a lot of companies is time consuming because they're not, necessarily readily available or easy to find.
You asked about the case study, and the first case study that we assembled was actually a fractional opportunity for both Greg and I. It's where an individual had purchased a business. Person had a tremendous sales background, had a great industry background, and understood the products and the customers very well, but had no experience really running a business, wasn't financially, as strong as he could have been. So he brought us in for a period of time as he learned the business, and we were able to help him assess his team, make some changes there to make improvements, and to get the business on an even stronger footing, if you will. And then gradually we phased out as we brought in people in both the president role and in the CFO roles.
Permanent hires require long-term vision, particularly in the family business space, where it's much more common for executives to work in a business for 5, 10, 15, 20. We've seen 30 or even 40-year tenured executives. That means that these transitions are slow and long and intentional. That requires a long planning process and careful due diligence in the assessment of candidates, and even before the assessment of candidates, in the preparation of what that role will be, how it will interact with the board, if there is a board, how it will interact with the principals, and what responsibilities it will have within the business itself. A good executive search in the family business space can run from 3 to 6 months. We've seen them run longer. It's entirely dependent upon the need of the business and the individuals that are running it, and also how the market responds to what the family principals are looking for. Permanent hire has long-term implications on the culture of the business and how it interacts with the family and how it interacts with the employees and how it executes strategy. In many cases, we find that family businesses are comfortable with long-term thinking. They think about their finance in generations, and they think about their strategy in a more slow motion pace than they will competitors in the publicly traded space or in private equity backed businesses. The idea of value generation is something that they can be very patient with. And we advise when considering permanent hires that patient attitude, that patient capital mindset be applied to human capital. Patient human capital and permanent hires go hand in hand when working with family companies on executive search.
So, Bill, can you give us an example where, a permanent hire is definitely the correct approach?
Sure, Tim. We recently worked with a family in Wisconsin that is in between their third and fourth generation, and they're coming up on their centennial. In this family company, the leadership position, the CEO position, has always been held by someone that shared the same last name as the founder. The incumbent CEO had worked in the business, worked somewhat briefly outside of the business, outside of college, but in now his mid-60s has effectively been working in the business for 40 plus years. He has made the plan to step back. He has a board of directors with independent directors. We worked with a search committee to bring a person on board. But this family's vision for the future is that they are going to step away from the operations of the organization while training the next generation of the family to be effective stewards and owners of the company, principals that do not work in the business. This transition, well painted out very nicely and well documented on paper, is ultimately strategy that requires people in the room that can work with the family along that timeline. A permanent hire is a great solution for this because the bridge, to borrow the word from the name of your company here, but the bridge between generations is long. And ultimately, the way the family interacts with the business is going to be changing. The incumbent CEO is going to step back, the family member is going to step back, and they're going to bring in their first non-family executive to run the company. And ultimately, non-family executives will run the company going forward as the family has no intentions on working on board. But the situation on the ground, despite that long-term strategy, is that you have a person who's very tied to the business, who's been there for 40 years, and they need an individual who can come in and help run the company and execute their strategy while understanding the very real relationship that the family, and particularly the incumbent family CEO, has to the business. That patient approach to the search, that search took about 9 months, but also we needed an individual that would be patient in understanding that coming in as a CEO in this type of business is going to be a different type of engagement than working with an ownership group that wants to sell in 5 years and take a rocket ship of value growth so that they can get multiples on exit. This family has no intention to sell, and the executive who comes in to work with that, the idea of value generation in this concept is maintaining the family values in this business over time so the next generation can benefit from the ownership of that business. And that charge as a CEO is a fundamentally different thing than when you're looking at leadership from other ownership groups. And the permanent hire solution is appropriate for that because of the time the transition will take as the incumbent family CEO retires, and rather I should say moves slowly into retirement, and the business slowly transitions to a professionalized executive leadership team.
One of the things that we really appreciate about you and your firm, Stranberg, is the attention to your clients and your clients' situations, your clients' goals, what they're trying to achieve, and you're looking for tailoring the best solution for them. You're not just looking to, get paid and plug somebody in the hole. You're looking for something that fits them to a T, and we just really appreciate that.
We certainly have our clients' interests at heart when we go about the work that we do. I'm pleased to share that Stranberg and Bridge Leadership Solutions have partnered in the creation of a tool that can help you understand the difference between fractional, interim, and permanent hires and help guide your clients or perhaps yourself towards which solution is most appropriate for you. The link to that tool is in the caption below. With that, I'll toss it over to Tim with Bridge Leadership Solutions to introduce the concepts.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the two right columns, interim and fractional. And we're just trying to give a thought process on what the situations are where an interim and or a fractional role might be appropriate. So an interim role is maybe a good fit if there's a lack of ownership alignment on what they are looking for in terms of a permanent hire or other aspects of the business. If there's an urgent need or a weaker supporting team. We did do one project recently. It was a company that was doing some critical launches. They were doing a permanent search for a new general manager, and they needed somebody to step in because of the critical launches and make sure they didn't skip a beat. So we did that for a couple months. Also, if there's an aversion to risk or relatively few, for whatever reason, qualified candidates. Where a fractional is more of an appropriate role is where there's, again, an urgent need or a weak supporting team, sometimes where affordability is an issue. If it's a smaller company and they need a stronger resource than they can afford, a lot of times a fractional is the right fit. Again, where there's a relatively high aversion concern about risk.
Permanent fit is best aligned when ownership is aligned, and we should say here that the shareholders of the business are aligned on the future strategy of the business and how your permanent hire, your permanent executive will help achieve those goals. There's also no affordability issues. We would push you to consider a compensation study and understand what the market cost of the executive you're looking to hire is and what that strategy will mean in the long term. In many cases, as an example, when we are creating new positions in family-owned companies, we need to look at what a long-term incentive plan is. And in many cases, families have no interest in giving equity to their non-family executives, but they will need to find a way to be competitive with the talent market and allow executives an opportunity to benefit from the growth and value they bring to the business. That price tag can limit the family's ability or at a minimum make them uncomfortable. A permanent hire will need to address those situations. And if you have discomfort there, you might look at other options as you're figuring out what the right solution is for you. And the final component is it must time well with succession. If you're bringing in an executive with the idea that they're going to someday be the CEO of your organization, but your incumbent CEO plans to die at their desk and never retire, bringing in a successor for that individual isn't going to work, as your incumbent person will need to make space for that new person to thrive. You can access this tool and its full breadth of insights at either Bridge Leadership Solutions website, the Stranberg website, and you can access those by clicking the link in the caption. So across this conversation, we've covered fractional, interim, and permanent hires. We've also covered the tool that we've created. Hint, you can access that in the caption. And we're going to close this month's conversation on how fractional or interim can dovetail with permanent hire to help family-owned companies navigate leadership transitions. And to highlight how this can work, I want you to consider a hypothetical situation of a growing family company who historically had the senior most financial role in their organization has been a controller. And they've reached the size and scope of work where a chief financial officer is becoming more and more relevant to their organization. But the family has never worked with such a person before. Tim and Greg, how would a fractional person help a family in that type of situation understand how a CFO can add value to their business?
Thank you, Bill. I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is, looking at, where is the business at and what are their aspirations in terms of where they want to go. And I think what a fractional is able to do is to kind of assess the current situation, the current skill set, the team, the depth of talent that they have. If you look at, I'll use a hypothetical example as well. I walked into a company, it's been 4 or 5 years ago, and they really had no idea of where they made money, right? It was a sausage grinder. They had these inputs, and at the end of the day, they had sausage that came out the back end, and it was, the sausage being profit, right? there's money left over. But ultimately, when you start to ask the question of, they had really four distinct channels. When you got into the questions of how are resources allocated, what's the profitability of the channels and the products within those channels, they didn't really have any idea. Nobody really thought about the business from that perspective. Again, using this specific example, when you start to set up and you start to ask the questions about, help me understand why we do this, or and doing it from a context of coming from a background, right, with the right fractional, where you have maybe a best practices background, you're an expertise in a particular function, in this case, finance. I think a lot of times, the questions that you ask often, because of these experiences with companies that are probably more sophisticated, you start to plant seeds about, do you really understand your business as well as you should? Are you measuring the right attributes, the right metrics? Do you understand where you're maybe leaving money on the table? So I think, it's a low risk way, right? For owners, CEOs, family members to, bring somebody in and allow them to have a little bit hands-on, right? Roll up their sleeves and get their hands a little bit dirty. It's really difficult from my perspective to go ask a CEO, particularly a long tenured CEO in a family business, to say, what is it that you really need? My experience has been is they have a really good idea of what they need, but a fractional often could come in and say, yes, I agree with these things, but I may have some different priorities or see some different things, where the organization could really add, more and more value. So, Bill, I think back to your point about, the cost and the expense of bringing a permanent on board. And if you start out with the wrong assumptions about what skill sets you need, it can be very, very costly in terms of, just the financial cost, but the opportunity cost of having the wrong person in the seat. I guess from my perspective, the other thing that the fractional can do, it can really help kind of define exactly what that looks like. So when I bring the CFO in and maybe they take on some of the responsibilities the controller used to do, is it completely a creative type role in the organization? Is there a restructuring that's required within, the finance organization? How are you going to manage that? How are you going to assure the key employees? So maybe in this case, the controllers are really key employee. They're very much valued, but you might be closing a door, right, in terms of a growth opportunity for them, and setting up those conversations, right, to have a holistic view to make sure you're covering all the bases. I think is an additional value that fractional can bring to the table.
A lot of family businesses, and Bill, you made this point earlier on in the conversation, a lot of family businesses, they've had the same people working, doing the same jobs for in many cases, years and decades, even decades. So bringing in an interim to transition to a permanent, an interim who has experience with different systems, with different processes, with different companies, and they've seen the best practices, some of the best practices, that can really demonstrate to a family business owner that there are values of bringing their position up to a CFO level, because they can bring their systems, their processes, and really their team up to that next level, which is really what they need to be able to break through to continue to grow the company in many cases.
What I love about the points you two have brought up is that what a fractional person can do in the context of a growing organization is demonstrate what's possible. And while that person won't be around forever, it lays the groundwork for what a CFO can do in the eyes of the principals of the business. It creates the condition, preps the ground, if you will, for the permanent hire. We've been in circumstances before where a family works with a fractional person. They do the groundwork of helping the principals understand what the value proposition of a CFO truly is and how that role is distinct from a controller. And then as that work gets established and grounded and the family understands the value, we begin an executive search for a CFO. Well, that fractional person is there. That fractional person can be a value add to the search process and even help in the transition to permanent hire. It benefits all parties in that chain, where the family gets to grow in a timeline that is helpful for them. The fractional person's business model is to work fractionally with that business and ultimately move on to bring value towards other business owners over time. So it allows the life cycle for the fractional person to work within their model while creating a firm platform for a permanent hire where that person understands what their role is going to be with the family, and the family understands what value that person is going to add. And that dovetailing of fractional to permanent hire is a great way to de-risk a transition into a new type of role that the family has no precedent for across their history. Okay, that's a wrap for this month. Many thanks to Tim and Greg from Bridge Leadership Solutions. In this series of conversations, we covered fractional and interim work, which is the core value that Tim and Greg work on, as well as permanent hires and executive search, which is what we do at Stranberg. Stranberg and Tim and Greg partnered in the creation of a tool that helps disambiguate the differences between those talent solutions and how they might be right for you or your client. You can find access to that tool as well as an article that covers everything that we've discussed across these videos in the caption. And that's all. We'll see you next month.